I was on the subway last Saturday here in Brussels, listening to a recent episode of Radiolab with host Latif Nasser. And at the end of the episode, listening to the credits...
That's it for this week. This episode was reported by me with help from Simon Adler, and it was produced by Simon
I found myself tearing up. Not just because it was a well-produced emotional story, but because it brought me back to a very mundane but pivotal moment 5 years ago when I was living in Toronto. It was around 7 p.m. on a weekday in the spring of 2019. I was cleaning the local designer's clothing store I worked at on Queen West, with a podcast playing in my ears. As I was closing the store, it got to the part where the host credited the different people who had shaped the story I had just listened to. The reporter, the producer, the assistant producer, the editor. And I remember thinking for the very first time, I want to be one of those people. I want to help bring real stories to life. Hi everybody, I'm Brune Smith, a freelance podcast producer looking to bring her skills to a podcast production team. This is week 2 of Podcasting Job, an 8-week limited series where I take you behind the scenes of my job search in real time. This week, as I was researching the Canadian, American, and European podcasting ecosystems, trying to see who I could offer my services to, I had a bit of a geographical conundrum. My path is nonlinear. I was born in France. I recently lived in Canada for 5 years, where I learned a ton about North American storytelling, and I just really embraced the culture. And for the last 2 years, I've been living in Belgium. So when it comes to positioning myself on the job market, my imposter syndrome this week was like, well, you're not currently in North America, and you weirdly feel new-ish to Europe. So will potential employers or clients on either side of the pond be interested in your point of view? And then it occurred to me, what if my very peculiar path is actually my strength and precisely what allows me to bring something extra to the future projects I'll be hired to work on. In order to pitch from a place of confidence, though, I found myself needing to look back on my experience and on the organic and dedicated ways I've honed my production skills on 2 continents. That's the story I want to share with you today. My hope, if you're also looking to embrace a creative career that feels really aligned with what you have to offer, is to inspire you to look for those threads in your own life. So let's go back. This is a story in 3 acts. Act 1 is the backstory that leads up to that pivotal moment at the store. It starts in France and has me crossing the Atlantic Ocean. Act 2 is set in Canada and has me following the craziest idea I ever had. And Act 3 is about the unexpected skills I decided to build as a direct result of coming back to Europe. All right. Act 1. It's 2014. I'm living in Paris, working as an account manager in the field of interior design. And that's when I discover the Moth podcast, and I become obsessed. It's recordings of live shows, often set in theaters across the US and elsewhere, where people from all walks of life go on stage and share a true story from their lives. And it's like the opposite of French culture. In France, we had a very different relationship to personal narratives. Unless you were a stand-up comedian or otherwise famous, talking about yourself publicly was deemed egotistical, like you were just self-centered. Not only that, but I had grown up to not share much about myself. In spite of having many friends, I often felt very separate from everyone else. But somehow the Moth stories made me feel deeply connected to humans who had a widely different life experience from mine. I secretly dreamed of being in the room at one of those shows. Fast forward to 2017, I move from Paris to Montreal, and to my surprise, I find a true storytelling show. I go to the event and I am hooked. Over the course of that evening, each one of the 6 storytellers transported me through vivid scenes of their lives, sharing emotions from grief to failure to infatuation and everything in between. And for the first time, I felt like I could be my full self and belong at the same time. 1 month later, I was on stage sharing a 2-minute story. I told an audience of strangers about the time I thought I was going to get killed by a bear outside my tent that turned out to be my friend's black Labrador. The rush of hearing people gasp and laugh and applaud was incredible. I started nerding out on storytelling, from taking workshops to reading all the books like Margot Lightman's Long Story Short, Jessica Abel's Out on the Wire, subtitled Secrets of the New Masters of Radio, or Lisa Cron's Wired for Story, and so on. I also started listening intensely to more podcasts like This American Life, Serial, Ear Hustle, Gimlet's Startup, and Radiolab. I then moved to Toronto shortly after and found my people in the vibrant local storytelling scene. And I found a job at a designer's clothing store on Queen West. Act 2. After I closed the store that evening I told you about at the beginning, I walked home, daydreaming about working away on someone's story in a production studio with the likes of Ira Glass and Latif Nasser. While that felt impossible, I did ask myself, how can I just get started? And the answer came a few months later, in the late summer of 2019, when I had the weirdest idea of my life. I know how I'm going to produce other people's stories, I thought. I'm going to produce a monthly true storytelling show, but I'm going to do it on Zoom. It was before Zoom was cool. We were in 2019, but I wanted to make this art form accessible to people who lived in cities and countries where there weren't any shows. I called the show Bodies of Stories and hosted the first one in January of 2020, figuring out Zoom stuff as I went, helping storytellers from Canada, the US, Europe, and elsewhere refine their stories ahead of time. When the pandemic hit a couple months later, a producer from a storytelling show in Toronto reached out to me to co-found the world's first 24-hour international all-true storytelling festival online. We and 2 other Canadian producers organized it. We rallied 15 other producers locally and abroad. And in June of 2020, over the course of 24 hours, 121 storytellers from across the globe shared true and personal stories. By then, the store on Queen West was closed indefinitely. I started working for myself, offering storytelling consulting and different things. And for a year and a half, I produced my show every month and connected deeply with people from everywhere through their stories. In 2022, the pandemic had disrupted my life plans and my visa in Canada, and I reluctantly had to go back to Europe after 5 years. A few days before taking the plane, I hit publish on a collection I edited of 20 of the 65 stories that had been told on Bodies of Stories. Act 3. I chose to land in Belgium. Not as confrontational a culture as France, not as respectful and socially advanced as Canada, but somewhere in the middle and a very international place. And it was precisely the absence of any kind of true storytelling scene in Brussels that made me start my first podcast. I wanted to stay connected to Canada and the US and to share my love of first-person stories with the people around me. So I created a podcast of interviews I called Première Personne with Brune Smith. In it, I interviewed people who had created brave spaces for others to share their stories, like Mark Lovett, a storytelling expert who had organized a TEDx in prison, or in a very full circle moment, Margot Lightman, an American storyteller whose book Long Story Short I mentioned earlier. I started that podcast with the mic on my wired earphones, recording on Riverside, and editing on Audacity. I loved learning all of it. In terms of work, I started helping individual writers commit to their blooming manuscripts, offering them accountability and a dedicated space where they could talk it out. I helped a group of writers write and self-publish in 2 months. It was all very fulfilling, but a few months ago I had a bit of a reckoning. I was exhausted from doing everything by myself, both in the interview podcast and in my work, and despite my best efforts, my business was too slow. I started looking for a job in different industries, going on job interviews, but nothing really stuck. And in January of 2024, just a few weeks ago, I realized my own writing practice had been stalled for a while, and in order to trick myself back into writing, I created my second podcast, one that I could sustain with short solo episodes. I wanted to keep expressing my lived experience in a way that would help others feel less alone. I called it the Brune podcast, tagline for people who feel things differently. And within just a few weeks of creating it, I had the last aha moment of this story. The reason why nothing had worked these past few months in terms of finding employment was that I was trying to get jobs where my precious talents would be wasted. I do feel self-conscious saying it like that, but it's true. I realized that the place where I can make the biggest difference while using all the skills I've honed these last few years and having a great time doing it is within a team in podcast production. So next week, I'm going to reach out to folks in the podcasting industry on both sides of the Atlantic. This story was produced and edited by me with help from Julia Mermelstein and Mitch Butler. Special thanks to Erin Rodgers. You can find the book Bodies of Stories, 20 Vulnerable Stories Told Live Online on Amazon. Thank you for listening. I hope you got something out of it. Before you go, I would like to kindly ask for your contribution. If you have any piece of advice for me or know anyone in the podcasting industry I could reach out to for help, please email me at brunesmith@substack.com. That's BRUNESMITH@substack.com. Don't forget to subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you're listening so you don't miss an episode. If you have friends who are creative thinkers of any kind, please share this episode on your socials. It might be of interest to them. Lastly, next time you're on the subway or in line at the grocery store, please think of me and leave a review of this podcast on Apple Podcasts so that others can discover it as well. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time.